I'm Susanna, Pyatt, the Collections and Archives Manager here at the Folk School, and this afternoon we're going over collection highlights from the Folk School's collections and looking at the Appalachian Craft Revival. So to start with, what is the Appalachian Craft Revival? It's generally defined as occurring between the 1890s and the 1940s, or right about around World War II. It was a period of relearning or introducing traditional craft forms in southern Appalachia. There was a major push for the revival coming from actually outsiders who were coming into the region as mountain workers, like educators, missionaries, social workers, and so on. And they wanted to help improve economic and social situations in the mountains, which was, at that time typically considered to be a pretty impoverished and uneducated region, if you go by the stereotype. The impacts on traditional Appalachian crafts during this time period are pretty complex. It's a revival of craft forms that had, for the most part, been part of mountain life in past generations, but were perhaps not practiced as much anymore, though it depends on which individuals or place you're looking at. So for example, weaving traditions often had skipped a generation or two as commercially manufactured textiles had become more available and more affordable. During the craft revival, weaving was more broadly reintroduced as a traditional craft, but there was also other influences that are brought in at the same time, because you have outsiders working with people in Appalachia to revive these crafts. Mountain workers coming into the region brought their own techniques, aesthetics, and ideas about tradition and marketing. So kind of another weaving example, Burita College weaving instructor Anna Ernberg was from Sweden. So she brought in Scandinavian influences while reviving weaving through Apparia's craft program, and also innovated her own form of loom to use in cottage industries for weaving. So the craft revival was not just as simple as reviving the same forms and styles of craft that had been done in Appalachia's past. It's also a remaking of traditional craft in the region. The craft revival was part of efforts to build up the Appalachian economy, often at a household scale. Mountain families and communities often faced outmigration to urban areas for jobs, or having to move off their farmland to work in coal mines or timber camps. So the craft revival was trying to offer an alternative to that. Before World War II, the primarily agricultural lifestyles in southern Appalachia raised little cash, but traditional crafts offered a source of cash income that could often be done as a cottage industry, so within people's homes, or at nearby community centers like settlement schools. It was an income source that was open to both men and women, and especially as a cottage industry, could sometimes be done in the hours around agricultural or domestic work, or as the seasons changed. Appalachian crafts became marketed on a national scale, important for the economic viability of craft production. Because they were known at a national level, there have been some interesting critical examinations of how the craft revival influenced Americans' perceptions and stereotypes of Appalachia. So historically, there's often a nostalgic or romanticized view of Appalachia as a region preserving pioneer past. And so, the revival of traditional crafts plays into that as well. Sometimes that view could be framed more negatively as preserving more backwards or ignorant lifestyles. The craft revival, with its emphasis on tradition, played into and supported these stereotypes. It also tended to focus on Anglo-American traditions and culture, often ignoring indigenous roots of craft forms or the contemporary traditions among Appalachian people of color. And in this presentation, I included a photograph of Arizona Swaney Blankenship, a Cherokee basket maker, just to note the importance of indigenous craft traditions in Appalachia, and specifically where we are on Cherokee lands. And you'll note that this image comes from the Museum of the Cherokee People rather than our own collections. And that's because there aren't really any well-documented objects or other materials in the Folk School's archives that represent people of color during the time period of the craft revival. So I had to pull from some other sources. Real quick, here's some other ways to get more information about the craft revival. Alan Eaton's Handicrafts of the Southern Highlands was published in 1937. It was pretty important for promoting crafts in a book form. It was illustrated with Doris Ullman's photographs. Mountain Homespun is by Francis Goodrich, and that was also published in the 30s. In, I think around 2008 or so, Western Carolina University did this online exhibit called the Craft Revival that pulls from a lot of archival sources here, the Southern Highland Craft Guild, Western Carolina, Museum of Cherokee People, and Qualla Co-op. And then There's some books more generally about the craft revival out there. Selling Tradition is one that I'm reading right now, the book by Gary Barker. And then there's also some other organization-specific ones. Anna Ferriello just re-released her book on the first 20 years of the folk school. And Phyllis Ozick has a book that covers several different meeting centers of the craft revival. So the craft revival, specifically at the folk school, as you probably all know, the folk school began in 1925, so pretty firmly within that time period of the Appalachian craft revival. And it was an important organization within craft revival history. Crafts taught during the first decades of the folk school included weaving, natural dyes, blacksmithing, wood carving, and woodworking, especially furniture making. Craft was included in the curriculum for the 5-month residential program for young adults, which was the core program of the original folk school. And various instruction was also available for community members. So craft production at the folk school was not limited just to students, but also involved the surrounding community. In line with the folk school's goals for community economic development, the folk school sold items made by students and community members. A craft guild or co-op was formed in 1928 to help market and sell local crafts, including brooms, baskets, hand-sewn and hand-woven items, dyed yarn, and wood carvings. And the Brasstown carvers soon emerged out of this guild. Olive Dane Campbell was also really instrumental in starting the Southern Highland Craft Guild, and the folk school is one of the first institutional members of the Southern Highland Craft Guild. So given that the folk school was founded in the middle of the craft revival, there's a lot of related items in the folk school's archives. So for this presentation, I'm pulling specifically from objects that were made before World War II, for the most part. There's a lot of related materials in the archives too. I'm pretty excited about Marguerite Butler Bistrop's papers. All of these photos are from her papers. This collection was donated to the folk school in August of 2024, and I just finished digitizing these a couple weeks ago. There's hundreds of photos from the 1920s through the 1940s that show activities at the folk school and also glimpses into the lives and homes of Brasstown community members. So 2 of these photos are probably taken at the folk school, the ones with the looms, but then the one of the Ledfords is in their home, and you can really see their interior, how they were decorating the interior and also using it as a site for making baskets. I also pulled from photographs by Doris Ullman. She was at the folk school in the early 1930s, especially around 1933 or so, taking photographs on campus and in surrounding areas. These are from Blairsville, Georgia. And there's now over 200 of her photographs in the folk school's archives. As I already mentioned, Alan Eaton's book on Southern crafts was illustrated with her photos, so they kind of help to visually define how Appalachian people, and especially artisans, should look through that book, what people might expect to see. Critical views of Ullman's work point out that she often historifies the people who she was photographing. So for example, you have the photo of Florence Conley, who was, I think, middle-aged when this photo was taken. Around 1933, she's posing with coverlets that she wove, but probably in 1933, she would not have been wearing this very 19th century style of dress with a big bonnet. So it's interesting to see how Doris Ullman had some of her photography subjects dress and present themselves. All right, so now to the objects. We're going to start with weaving and fiber arts. These are 2 hand-painted drawdowns, weaving drawdowns of patterns, and these were painted by Frances Goodrich. So she, if not started the coverlet revival in the 1890s, was one of the big early people for reviving coverlet weaving. She started the Allen Stand Craft Store in also the 1890s, and that later becomes part of the Southern Highland Craft Guild. And yeah, it's really neat that we have these 2 painted patterns by her. I'm not sure how Pam Howard, the former resident weaver here, got these, but these were donated to the folk school from her collection. She had done a lot of research in the craft revival and the weaving traditions. Moving ahead with the patterns, these are from the Hogan family collection. Alice and Pam Alice and Paul Hogan lived in Cherokee County, Georgia, so kind of the edge of Appalachia. Their collection has over 170 weaving drafts and drawdowns. The ones that have dates are from the late 1930s. Most of them don't have dates, but that seems to be when the collection is from. And so they were going around regionally and collecting patterns and also designing their own. They started a weaving business called Kennesaw Mountain Industries around 1940. So it's probably what they were collecting patterns to use for. And one of the work studies last year did a lot of the processing for this collection. So many of these are digitized, and I can send images to people. And she wrote a nice blog post about the collection too that you can see on the Folk School's website. This one's a slight mystery. The back of the frame is marked that it's a Folk School tapestry weaving from the 1940s with embroidery by Eloise Steele. I think it might be a little bit earlier than the 1940s based on some other information about Eloise. She was born in Ohio in 1868, and her main work was actually with a women's craft shop up in Nova Scotia. But she got to know Southern Mountain workers, kind of doing similar work, just a different region, including Marguerite and Olive, and she came down to the Folk School in 1938 for some amount of time to work on designs for the Folk School's craft shop. And there's a great quote from Olive Dane Campbell in a letter from 1938 where she explains that, by the way, it was Eloise Steele, you remember, who got us started on the weaving of the mountain scenes like this. We tend to be more familiar with the mountain tapestry weavings from the work of Alice Tipton, who was a student at the Folk School in 1938 to 39. She married another student, Cecil Tipton, and together they both worked at the Folk School until the 1970s. Alice mainly worked in the dining hall, but she also did a lot of weaving and became known for these mountain tapestries. We have 3 of her tapestries in the archives, and also this purse that was made by her. And the clasp was carved by Herman Estes. And in the archives, we have this photo that's probably from Alice and Cecil's wedding in 1940, and then a later photo of Alice demonstrating weaving to one of her Folk School students in the 70s. And then there's a couple more woven purses in the archives. These are 2 of there's maybe 4 or 5 total. Unfortunately, a lot of the textile collection doesn't have good information about it, which Linda can attest, having gone through all of it.
None.
Yeah. So a lot of these we assume are connected to the Folk School because they're in the archives, but we don't know for sure. So I think, Nanette, this purse came from all of Dame's family members, right?
Marcia Button,
Yeah.
her great niece, yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm sure that's Folk School related.
And then the photo up on the screen right now has more purses on display. This is a photo that was labeled as being taken, I think on the last day of school at the Folk School. So it's an exhibit of student work.
Happy Clappy.
Yeah, the original Happy Clappy. This is this is a woven tablecloth, probably a pattern variation on Lee's Surrender. And it's attributed to Evelyn Smith, who was a student in 1934 to 1935. There's a couple clothing items that are documented in the collection. This skirt was made by Doodles Estes in 1940, and the documentation with it says that she made it under Murray Martin's instruction. And then this dress was made by another student, also around 1940, named Jeannie James, and she made it for Marguerite Butler Vistra. And among Marguerite's photos, there's this one. I don't actually know which of the women in the photo is Jeannie, but it's like she's one of them, according to the caption. And the photo was taken of the students wearing feed sack skirts, which they made themselves. Granny Donaldson's cow blankets, as they're called, are a pretty common image to see from the Folk School archives and Southern Appalachian crafts. Granny Donaldson, her first name was Kate, was from Marble, North Carolina, I believe. And her blankets are made of crocheted figures appliqued onto fabric. They were termed cow blankets by Alan Eaton. He seems to have gotten the term from like a ceremonial textile that was used in Italy, and he thought that they looked similar to what Granny Donaldson was making, even though hers don't have anything to do with cows, unless there's a cow on it. And she did not draw her inspiration from Italy. There's 5 or 6 of her cow blankets in the folk school archives, and then there's others. I think the Southern Highland Craft Guild has even more, like maybe over a dozen. And I know there's some at the Shelton House in Waynesville too, and probably some other regional organizations. And these are some photos of her from Marguerite's collection, which are interesting because they also show her doing other forms of textile work, like carding and spinning. Oh, and the caption labels her as Granny D, which I think is funny because it's like the original Granny D.
Is that the folk school's log cabin?
I don't think so. I've tried to compare. There's a lot of log cabin photos in Marguerite's collection, and it's hard to tell which are people's homes and which are the log cabin museum. And I think when I tried to match up like doors and windows, this one didn't match up well, but I'm not entirely sure.
I thought the story about Granny Donaldson had to do with, what was the guy that did the big craft collection?
Alan Eaton?
Yeah, Alan Eaton brought a cow blanket to Brasstown, and she looked at it and said, I could do better than that. And by the next day, he had brought a cow blanket in of her own construction.
Okay, I've heard it both ways, both that like he saw her work and was like, oh, these are cow blankets, and that he introduced her to it. So I'm not sure which one is the correct story. One of my favorite collections to show to people are these dye recipe cards. There's around 107 of them. They're dated from 1930 to 1942. And they're another little bit of an archival mystery because the box that they're in is labeled for Fanny McClellan. And Fanny came to the folk school to learn puppetry in 1944. She ended up becoming the craft business manager here and stayed until 1962. And she learned natural dyeing from Louise Pittman. But she came here in 1944. The last date on the card is from 1942, so that doesn't quite match up. More likely, and maybe someone who's been around longer knows more of the story behind these were probably Louise Pittman's recipe cards that she gave to Fanny. Louise Pittman arrived at the folk school as a Quaker American Friends Service Committee volunteer in 1928, and she took on the school's craft sales department and ran that until 1945. And then went on to become the director of the Southern Highland Craft Guild. And she learned natural dyeing from Wilmer Stone Viner, who I think like literally wrote the book on natural dyeing early on. So these are probably Louise Pittman's cards. They're really neat. They have different samples of the dyed yarn. Most of them are dated. They have where the yarn came from, and of course how it was dyed with what materials and the mordant and things like that. And there's a couple photos of natural dyeing from the archives. There's one of Louise Pittman that was taken by Doris Ullman, and then also some students, probably students rather than community members, with a dye pot, both around the 1930s. And then there's blacksmithing. This is not a collection that I know as much about at this point. It's been inventoried, so there's a list, but there's not like photos to go with it or where they are in the archives yet. So it hasn't been well researched yet. If anybody wants a volunteer project, this is a good one. But probably all of the early work that we have is from Oscar Cantrell. He was a Brasstown native. He began working at the folk school as one of the earliest staff members in 1926 working on the farm part of the school. But he ended up becoming a blacksmith instructor, and he also forged like a lot of utilitarian ironwork that can probably still be seen around campus. And the Oscar Cantrell Blacksmith Shop, as we now call it, was built for him in 1946. And this is one of the pieces that's pictured up here. It's currently on exhibit at the Folk Art Center. And some more examples of his work. This photo was taken in the 1950s. And then on to woodworking, which besides wood carving, typically in the early days referred to furniture making, as far as I can tell. There's not a lot of this in the archives either, or at least not that's well documented. The 4 main pieces that we have were made by Verlin Reese, and these are also a recent donation since I've been here, so in 2024 or 2025. And I really like Verlin's story because he kind of highlights what the goal of the folk school was for its early students. Verlin was from the region and attended the school as a young adult in the 1930s and worked on the farm and learned furniture making here. He went on to get some additional agricultural education elsewhere. He worked at the folk school dairy and the Mountain Valley Creamery down the road for a little bit. He also went off for a couple years to Georgia and worked at the creamery at the Raven Gap School. In 1942, he and his wife Sue returned to Brasstown, and they used the student loan fund from the folk school to borrow money to purchase their own farm and build a home, which I believe is where Mo lives now. Yeah, so it's still around. So it's a successful example of a student using their experience at the folk school and the folk school's resources that are available for students to develop their talents and skills and be able to stay in the area and be able to earn a living here and raise a family and stay on the land as farmers. And this chest, Hope Chest by him, is I think particularly gorgeous. That's also on exhibit right now in the Folk Art Center. And there's also a desk, and the cover is really interesting too. Sorry the photo isn't better. And then wood carving. Wood carving is the biggest set of objects in the archives by far. There's over 1,700 wood carvings. So some background on wood carving and the Brasstown carvers. Not all of the wood carving at the folk school was part of the Brasstown carvers, but that's what's pretty dominant at this point. In both the records in the archives and the wood carvings in the archive, and also what people remember about wood carving programs here. As best I can tell, the first wood carving class was in 1930, and then the Brasstown carvers started in 1931, but usually it's a little murky. The earliest instructors for carving included Park Fisher, who was on staff here already, Margaret Campbell, no relation to Olive and John Campbell. She was at Pleasant Hill Academy in Tennessee, and then Jane Chase. Marie Martin came here in the early 1930s as a craft instructor. Her background was in weaving, but she took charge of the carving program in 1935 and led it until 1973, so very influential on the shape of the Brasstown carvers. And the Brasstown carvers ended up really with an international reach in some ways of their carvings getting out into the world. Wood carving was done by students, like the ones in the photos. It was taught to students, and then it was also the community effort with the Brasstown carvers. And part of that folk school trying to establish economic support for people in the area. So this quote is from 1933, and so even just 2 years after the establishment of the Brasstown carvers as a group, they're really helping with giving local people a cash income in the middle of the Great Depression. And I think this photo is Hayden Hensley bringing in finished carvings for Louise Pittman to examine, which was kind of the system. Wood carvers once a week would pick up blocks or blanks to carve into certain figures and then bring them in the next week to be assessed and purchased by the craft shop. And then from there, the craft shop would market them across the country. And these are some pretty nice photos from Marguerite's papers. Most of these are unidentified, but I think they're Brasstown carvers rather than students. Obviously, Olive and Campbell is in the one on the top left, but no one else in this set is identified. And then I'll go through just a few examples from the archive. Again, there's over 1,700. It's hard to pick which ones to highlight. There's a bunch on display in the dining hall right So on this page, there's a turkey that was carved by Park Fisher. Again, he's one of the first wood carving instructors. And then a St. Francis statue by Murray Martin. And in the center, Murray, that's probably the earliest photo we have of Murray. I almost didn't recognize her because I'm used to seeing her older. She's on the right there. One of the halls, I think John Hall, is in the center. And also in the photo, you can see how prolific their carving was. Like, there's images from like the 30s and 40s and 50s of just tables full of carvings that people have made. And also, most of the people I'm highlighting today are men, because in the very earliest years of the Brasstown carvers, it was mainly men who were carving. But by like World War II, there's a shift to it, also including a lot of women as well. So here's some pieces by Hayden Hensley. He is credited as the first Brasstown or the first person to make a carving at the folk school. He carved a goose, so maybe like the one on the left there. He was one of the first folk school students. He actually attended in 1927 and married another student, Bonnie Logan, in 1931. And before World War II, both Hayden and Bonnie made most of their living from carving. Hayden was doing the carving and Bonnie was doing the sanding on his pieces. And so their house is referred to sometimes as the house that carving built. And then here's another Doris Ullman photo of J.O. Penland and one of his pieces. J.O. was an early supporter of the folk school. We have a pledge card from him from 1925. He was a farmer and carpenter by trade. And earlier we actually saw a photo of him and his wife Callie making brooms. They were part of the craft guild, Brasstown Craft Guild as well. And their children, like I think at least 3 of their children were also early students at the folk school, including Hollis, their son, who became a Brasstown carver as well. So especially in the early years, there seems to be even more of the generational work in the Brasstown carvers. Because next up we have the Beaver family. Nolan Beaver began carving first in 1935, and he was already a whittler and a woodworker, but then took up more of the Brasstown carver style. His parents and many of his 9 siblings and some of their spouses were also involved with the carvers, whether it was doing the carvings or like sanding and finishing them. And yeah, this photo has 2 of the Beaver brothers, and then Curly Fleming was, I think, a brother-in-law twice over.
Susanna, as I'm looking at this, I noticed a number of photographs where what we would call the back door, the back steps of Keith House is the stage. Was this the front door of Keith House at the time?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was much less wooded from the photos I've seen. There's also photos where people are using the lawn as like an area to gather. There's about to be even more photos of the carvers on the stairs.
Was Avery the brother who fell on the knife?
Yes, that is why his death date is rather early. We also know all of his work was produced between the late 30s and 1943. Avery died in an accident where he was riding in a wagon and carving, and the wagon was jostled by a car going by and he fell on his neck.
It was going over Martin's Creek Road.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
All right, and that says it was going over Martin's
There's
Creek
a
Road.
lot of information about all these stories that are so amazing. I have a couple of other things I will tell you at the end, if that's okay.
Okay. And some of Avery Beaver's carved horses, he was best known for his horses, were given by FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt to, it was then Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret in England. And he also earned, in 1942, he earned $1,000 from his work carving at the folk school, which must have been a really incredible number, because they were not highly paid for their carvings. And that was the highest carver payout for that year.
Nolan was famous for tiny, tiny little carvings.
Oh, yeah.
That were astonishing.
Yeah, some of Nolan's pieces,
With wings and
the smallest pieces are in the dining hall right now, and it is like that big, like a pencil stick almost. On the left is Jay Morris with one of his squirrel carvings. He started carving during the Great Depression. Again, most of the time when there's photos in the archives, they're of him much older rather than this earlier one from Marguerite's papers. My favorite story that I've heard about him was that he won a TBA contest for a pair of squirrel bookends. I'm guessing they look similar to the one he's holding in that photo. And his reward for that was that they asked him to carve 300 pairs of bookends in 3 months, which is impossible.
Did they pay for them, or?
I assume it was, that they would pay him
buy
for it.
them?
Yeah. And so, apparently he managed to get 100 carved, which is pretty impressive in that time frame. And then on the other side is Cal Massey. He's another one of the first Brasstown carvers and a farmer by trade. And 2 of his daughters, Pearl Massey and Nellie, also became carvers in the 40s and 50s. And then we have the Hall family, which is a pretty long, multi-generational carver family, but it starts with brothers John, Ben, and Elisha. They moved here from Buncombe County in the 1920s, and then took up wood carving in the 30s. And then, so the next generation of their family, or several of them. And these are some carvings by Elisha, who I think Ben and John become more famous as carvers, so it's nice to be able to see some of Elisha's work too. There's only a few pieces by him in the archive. And Ben's son, Jack Hall, is one of the next generation of Halls that became carvers, and Jack ended up taking over as leading the carvers after Murray Martin retired.
Did you post the movie about Jack Hall on the Folk School YouTube channel? Jan just
Oh, yeah.
discovered that. He was very excited about that.
I think that went up to date I think it's 1951. There was a 36-minute movie made about Jack Hall called The Highland Woodcarver, and it just went on our YouTube channel.
It was Howard Kester who was directed it, one of the folk school directors that was between Olive and Marguerite. Yeah.
It was actually a State Department effort, and so they hired a film company to make the documentary, and he was director at the time and introduced, made sure that that Jack was participating, but it was really the State Department's
That makes more sense.
thing as opposed to ours, yeah.
But it was fun to see Howard Kester in the film too, because I don't think we have photos of him at the folk school,
Yeah.
or at least not identified. This is not as old an example by Ruth Fleming Hawkins. I don't think any of her really old pieces, but she was one of the first female Brasstown carvers. She started in 1937 at age 20, so pretty young. And eventually she ended up making a lot of her own patterns, especially for Christmas ornaments, like the ones that are similar to the ones that are in this kind of two-dimensional creche scene here. And her son Claude also took up carving. And then there's Hope and Glenn Brown. They began carving around 1940. Glenn was known for his birds. He did the goose or duck that's up there. And Hope was known for cats and also creche or nativity scene figures. And said that the faces were based on her children. She had 8 children, I believe. And you can see one of them posing as an angel there. And then finally, to show that not all of the carvings are Brasstown carver carvings, there's Fred Smith. He moved from Overton County, Tennessee in 1936 to this area to attend the folk school. He sold his carved pieces through the craft shop and then opened his own business called Smith Craft, became a member of the Southern Highland Craft Guild. Some of his pieces that are in the archives match up with drawings by June Coolidge Carey, Olive Jane Campbell's niece, from the 1940s. So she was either designing or sketching for marketing, or both, some of the types of items that were made by the craft shop. And we have several of his pieces, like the ones pictured here. The Southern Highland Craft Guild has several of his carvings too, including one that's currently up on exhibit. And then just some other things that aren't so folk school related, but they're really neat from the craft revival, and they happen to be in our archives. This piece was from Penland Pewter, which was run by Ralph Siler Morgan Sr., possibly somewhat single-handedly. His son was involved too, I think, at this point. He was the brother of Lucy Morgan, who founded the Penland School. So Pewter started there, but then he also had his own business, and as best I can tell, this is from his business rather than from Penland School. It would be from the 1930s, most likely. And there's not pottery, craft revival pottery, in the folk school archives from here, because the pottery program here didn't start until 1952. But we do have a couple pieces from Pisgah Forest pottery. And then these I also recently cataloged, and there's a fun mystery about these. These were donated to the folk school in 2009. They're a set of glass plate negatives. And the ones that are on this slide depict the Tryon toy makers, so they're from like 45 minutes east of Asheville, almost into the Piedmont region. And the Tryon toy makers was founded by the same two women who founded Biltmore Industries, and then they moved to Tryon and started this organization to teach like teenagers, I think mostly teenagers and young adults, how to do carving and woodworking, and then they could sell their toys for income. The glass plate negatives that we have for the Tryon toy makers were published in a 1917 article titled "Regenerating Handicrafts in the Carolinas" by Lida Rose McCabe. And then also in the same collection, there's the glass plate negative for this photo, which according to the Southern Highland Craft Guild, where this photograph is, it's from the 1890s or the 1900s. So the photograph was published in Frances L. Goodrich's 1931 book, Mountain Homespun. And the photograph that is up online is from her collection, but somehow we ended up with a glass plate negative in with a collection of Tryon toy makers photos. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure the whole history of those negatives. It's really weird that we have the negatives, but they have the photos in her collection. And otherwise, it's a really fascinating photo. We actually first found this when a volunteer was looking on information on working reels, because we put one up into the log cabin museum. So this is two women working or preparing the work for a loom, and they're not only using a working board against the wall of the cabin, but they're also using that working reel that's out in the yard. And then some more, these are more glass plate negatives. Again, the photos themselves were in the Frances L. Goodrich collection at the Southern Highland Craft Guild, and were published in her book, Mountain Homespun, but we have the glass plate negatives.
I feel like I should go ahead and throw this in now while I'm talking about Mountain Homespun again. So in 1990 or so, Jan was the curator at the Mountain Heritage Center, and he was working on a big traveling show for the Smithsonian. It was a coverlet show. And he found a copy of Mountain Homespun, which was out of print. It was the original hardback. And he got so interested in that he wrote a 75-page introduction to that book and had it reprinted, brought it up to date with all of the current information about the Crafts Revival movement. And it was published by Tennessee University Press. So that book has all kinds of photographs in it. And when he was working on that book, he went up to New England to visit Frances Goodrich's remaining relatives that were still alive. And they gave him this huge portfolio of watercolor paintings that Frances had done, and these original drawdowns for the coverlets. And I'm wondering if maybe Pam got her drawdown from Jan. But we have those watercolors. So anyway, this book was reprinted, and one of the cool things about it was that the reason why the Crafts Revival movement was so accepted by the world, the country, whatever, was because the centennial, 1875 centennial, kind of got folks interested in colonialism, and everybody wanted to decorate their homes with handmade items. So Frances Goodrich picked up on that, And of course, she had at the same time discovered this weaving tradition in the Allenstand area where she was a missionary. So she built a little log cabin on the back of a pickup truck and drove it up to Washington, D.C., and it was loaded with crafts that were made from that community in the Asheville area. And so she was the founder of the Southern Highland Guild, and of course Olive was her contemporary, but much, much younger. Frances was quite a bit older than Olive. So anyway, that story is pretty astonishing, and it goes on and on. There was there were weavers from Allenstand who wove overshot rugs for the White House, and I believe Grover Cleveland was the president at the time. So there's photographs of that, and Jan's reprint of Mountain Homespun. It used to be sold in the craft shop. Have you ever seen that, the copy that Jan printed? Okay, so it's a more recent copy than the one that was photographed here.
Any other questions, additions?
Where was Oscar's shop? If the shop that's named for him is built in '46, do we know where he worked? And was there instruction? Was there any evidence that students learned blacksmithing from him and pieces that might have come from that experience?
I think his shop was in Tower House originally, is my understanding. And I think we have photographs that somewhat show that. It's kind of hard to tell. But then, yeah, I'm not sure where he learned blacksmithing from, or when it started being taught here, and what that whole progression was. I don't know. Lynette, do you know?
I'm not sure.
He had a shop at his house.
Mm-hmm.
Jan would know.
Okay.
What are William Morris's dates in England? Is there a relationship between the attention he brought to crafts and tradition and what was happening here
There's got to be.
in this part of the country? What were his dates? Do you happen to remember?
He's definitely 19th century. I don't remember when he passed away, if he was in the 20th century, but I think most of his writings are 19th century.
It was the Industrial Revolution time.
Yeah.
It was 1860s, 1870s, I think, is when he died. But it was all a reaction to the mechanization of the world and how people were losing touch with handmade items, and that it was important to save those. John Ruskin and William Morris both wrote about that extensively, and Charles Rennie Mackintosh from Scotland. It's an amazing
Does
story.
Alan Eaton refer to him in his book? I can't remember.
I haven't actually read his book yet.
I think that he does. I'm feeling like that there was some kind of reference to that, but what Alan Eaton, I think, writes more about is much later than his era. He sort of concentrates. What I recall, maybe it's just a takeaway of mine, was that Eaton's book really focuses on specifically, because it's specific to Appalachia, what of the craft was, you might consider already here or indigenous almost to the region, and what ended up being adopted as part of the movement because it was either convenient or the skill set was here to reproduce it, or what have you. And so coverlets were actually one of those things that had, what I recall, had sort of faded from, people weren't making them. Until the woman in Berea took patterns that were not from Appalachia at all, and essentially started an industry, helping young women learn how to make coverlets again. But that tradition of weaving coverlets out of Berea, some of those patterns were never Appalachian, but have become Appalachian because Berea College is selling them, or did for a long time. So
I think drawdowns were handed to Frances Goodrich in the Asheville area from local weavers who said, hey, look at this, and she's like, oh my gosh, what is this? And really helped them establish an economy there on weaving and coverlet making that lifted them out of, value-added products for farmers. That story is told in the book, in the Mount Homespun book.
But to go back to the question, I think like the arts and crafts movement is a different thing from the craft revival, but I think they are still kind of, in some ways, coming out of like a similar impulse. It's just different expressions of wanting to go back to that kind of pre-industrial handicraft. And maybe with William Morris and Ruskin, it seems more about like almost like an elevated art thing, and with the craft revival for the people making it, it seems more like this is an economic support in addition to it being like traditional is the importance there.
mm-hmm.
So I don't know, it's kind of almost like a continuum of craft history, I think. And even now, like it seems artificial to be like the craft revival is only the 1890s to the 1940s, because what we're doing here at the folk school is a direct descendant from the craft revival.
It's still going on.
Yeah. When I add things to the Southern Appalachian digital collections, it ends up getting coded for the craft revival collection because it's still like handicrafts that are being done in Appalachia. So yeah, it just continues in different forms, I think.
It's fun to see these glass plate negatives. Yeah. Those are pretty special.
One of my favorite stories, which I have to inflict on you, has to do with the president of Berea College doing a fundraising tour up to New England at the time when it was a revival of interest in colonial goods. And he took with him a stack of coverlets that had been given in by country students to pay for their tuition. And so he didn't know what he was going to do with them, but okay. So he took a stack of them. So he ends up taking them up to New England. I don't know where he went. And after he got done talking about his good work down in Berea, Kentucky, a woman came up and said, are you selling those? And he said, these? And before he knew what happened, he sold all of them. So he gets back to Berea. He calls Granny so-and-so now. So I always think of myself right here. And he says, Granny, come here, I need to talk to you. How long would it take you to make 100 of them? And Granny says, well, let's see. First we have to keep the sheep alive for a year, which is what I always say. She said, then we have to shear it, then we have to pick it, and we have to wash it, and then we have to dye it. Well, President Frost would take us most of 2 years to make 20 of them. He said, 20 of them? I can sell all you can make. So then he starts calling in all kinds of people that are willing to come, and nobody remembers how to do it. And then he imports Anna Örnberg, who was up in Chicago, where she's from Sweden. I've told you this story before, I've inflicted it on you. And so she ended up developing the craft again, but the setting was on a loom that she designed, which we have seen in Cherokee, we've seen it here, in Berea, we've seen it all over the place. And the product might have been overshot, but it was reduced to pillar tops and door pulls and things that were easier to sell because they were less expensive.
Yeah, and that's Alan talks about her quite a bit, and the patterns that she was using, not necessarily being from Appalachia.
We used to know in Bellevue, who did we used to know in it?
Wilma McNabb.
Wilma McNabb.
Yeah.
So Wilma McNabb is part of, when you read her bio that I happen to have seen, she learned from her mama. So we'd have to go ka-ching and see where it is in the calendar that these things occurred. But it was also also being revived in the area.
Mhm.
And she was impacted by Lucy Morgan's sister. Lucy Morgan went to Berea and learned to weave from Anna Umber. It's just kind of like, yeah, pretty fun.
Yeah.
But I think they didn't keep sheep much more.
I was gonna say, speaking of her mother, there's
Yeah.
Granny Hatchet.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's Wilma McNabb's mother?
I believe so, rather than her grandmother.
Oh.
I
Uh-huh.
don't remember everybody's name. There are a lot of hatchets out in Martins Creek.
Yeah. And I think Granny Hatchet's loom is disassembled in the Fiber Art Studio.
I think that's right, yeah.
It was in the Log Cabin Museum, and then when Norman Kennedy came to teach first, he wanted to move it so they could actually weave an old style loom, and that's how it got into the weaving studio. Still over there.
Mhm.
But you see, it's big. You would put, a screen around it and put chickens underneath or keep a baby there or whatever. It's big. And they were weaving 2 to 3 panels instead of, and they all had to line up and everything had to be just so. And the whole revival got into much smaller products.
You know, the other loom in the photos there is probably an Ernberg loom, so you can tell the size difference. The Ernberg loom was made to be smaller so it could fit more easily in a house, and also to make the smaller problems. Great. Well, thanks for coming out tonight.
Thanks.